Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Trump scapegoats gas companies for price hikes caused by his Iran war from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump doing that, but I don't really care for a lot of stuff that Trump does. But you just can't just say the same. It's pretty much just every post in the subreddit is some variation of Orange Man Bad. And but you say Orange Man Bad the first time, that's fine. But when we say it for the trillionth time, eventually you just kind of get tired of it. So yeah, personally, if you want to say Orange Man Bad 24/7, you should be able to. But eventually people are just gonna get tired of it. Next we have the last time NYC elected a mayor like Mamdani, it ended with bankruptcy, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and that's a YouTube video from Reason TV, and they added all hail moron Mamdani. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Mamdani. He's very much the opposite of Javier Milei. If you ask me, Javier Milei is pretty much going to everything but Israel, but Mamdani's pretty much bound to everything but Israel. But ultimately, if he wants to be the mayor and run New York into destitution, he should be able to. But it doesn't really matter, because it doesn't really matter which party politicians in there. They're just gonna spend like there's no tomorrow, and it doesn't really matter who's in there, because the government's it's just gonna screw you over no matter who's in the position of power, and that's very much how politics works. It doesn't really matter who you vote for, you're always gonna get screwed over, unless maybe a third party candidate wins, but that's not too likely these days, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Weird How That Happens, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a YouTube short from Monte Matter, who I guess she's talking about, she's some shit lib talking about the Patriot games or whatever. And eventually, if you want to link to whatever YouTube, Twitter, Reddit shit libs you want, I think you should be able to. But eventually, you just kind of get tired of it all. If you want to, as I said earlier, if you want to say Orange Man Bad every day for over 4,000 days now, you should be able to. But eventually, you just kind of get tired of it all. Next we have United States law to force entire internet to require age verification will pass the Senate from YouTube.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's cross-post from the digital privacy subreddit, and that looks like YouTube video from Chibi Reviews. And yeah, personally, I don't think the state should be forcing the internet platforms to require age verification if they don't want to, but the state can force internet platforms to do whatever it wants to a lot of the time, especially if their servers are located in that country, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. I personally don't think the state should be controlling the internet. I don't think the state should be controlling anything else. But, ultimately, the state's in a position where it has the ability just by controlling whatever it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. I'm sure if the in-group was still in power, Sleepy Joe and the Democrats, Reddit would be completely fine with this. They'd find a way to justify it. But since it's Don and the Republicans, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And, it doesn't really matter. The government's going to keep screwing you over regardless of which branch of the party is in power, and that's very much how politics works. Next we have Trump's fertilizer tariff retreat is another admission that tariffs raise prices from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And I personally agree with this. I think the libertarian position is if you want to pay tariffs, you should be able to, but tariffs are just a form of taxation, and libertarians believe that taxation is theft if you don't consent to it, and tariffs are simply a tax on imported goods. So, I think if you don't want to pay any Trump's tariffs, you shouldn't be forced to do so, but ultimately, Trump's in the position of authority to implement whatever tariffs he feels like, and oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it, because, a lot of people are going to defer what the president says in matters of law, and I personally don't think you should justify doing whatever the president says, but he has the ability to justify enforcing whatever laws he wants, because that's what the executive branch is for, the enforcement of the law, and that's ultimately what really matters, not who writes the laws, which is what the Congress is supposed to do, or who decides whether the laws are constitutional or not, which is what the Supreme Court is supposed to do, but rather how laws are enforced. And you can write down anything on a piece of paper and say it's a law, but what matters is how that law is enforced. Next we have anarcho-capitalism is an outcome and expression of collectivism, posted by Ryan Blizzard, and they said, anarcho-capitalists argue that dismantling the state is necessary to establish a free society. They claim it wrong to impose morality by force. and that government as a monopoly necessarily does this, since on moral grounds it excludes competitors. These anarchist fallacies of pacifist implications of their position because they think in terms of groups instead of individuals, conjuring many competing, i.e. conflicting police forces is a market for justice. Those pacifist implications become avoidable if they realize that both government and a defense agency are just groups of individuals. When we reach to the level of individual to individual interactions, it becomes clear that not being able to exclude competition means no individual can use force to defend himself. The purpose of the police is to establish a monopoly of force over human interactions to force others to obey their idea of what ought to be. In fact, the wielding of force is a monopolistic by its very nature. It is a subjugation of one side will to that of the other. The monopolistic position is not affected by whether the force wielder is called the government or John's defense agency. Only a collectivized mentality can hold that the police, acting on my behalf, cannot forcibly exclude competitors, but a defense agency can. The non-initiation of force principle is itself a moral principle. Individual rights are moral principles. Thus, the argument for moral freedom reduces to the advocacy of pacifism. Their actual obligation to the government is not to its monopolistic character, but the fact that a quote-unquote a government is by the means of placing the retaliatory use of physical force under objective control, i.e. under objectively defined laws. Ayn Rand, The Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. To place the wielding of retaliatory force under objective control, the police must enforce a single monopoly standard concerning its use, including banning and forcibly expanding competition on the grounds that they enforce unjust laws by unjust means. Anarcho-capitalists contrast this by describing a situation in which anyone can compete with the government by going it into the business of justice and wielding force, but no one has the right to deploy force unilaterally without legal authorization. There is no right to the arbitrary use of force, and force is used arbitrarily whenever it is used outside of legal safeguards that establish force as retaliatory. For example, if you march into town and shoot Arnold in the street because you say he murdered your cousin, it is irrelevant that you know that in your mind that he's a killer. You are using force in defiance of the procedures by which guilt and liability must be established, but by that very fact, you are a threat to other citizens, and the government must stop you to defend citizens' rights. It's only when retaliatory force is deployed according to the defined laws and the public can see that it is so that there is a clear demarcation between the initiation of force and the retaliatory use of force. The failure of anarcho-capitalists to see this brings me to a second point. They accept the statist approach of playing production and force, the dollar with the gun. The left claims that the concentrations of wealth on the market is from force. The libertarian anarchists claim that force is just another service of the market, though they can come at it from different angles. Both are wrong, producing and exchanging values of the opposite of physical force. A free market presupposes that force has already been extracted from human interactions. Market mechanisms can establish or project the preconditions of there being a free market. And yeah, I guess I would kind of agree with all that. I personally think, and I agree with Ann-Kempster quite a bit, but just because someone's a private actor doesn't mean that their authoritarianism is justified. Just because it's not from the state doesn't mean it's not authoritarian. I think the libertarian position is you got to stand against authoritarianism regardless of who it's coming from, whether it's coming from the state or a private actor, and that's my thoughts there. Next we have How Taxes on Groceries Are Driving American Families to Hunger from thehill.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is you shouldn't be taxed on anything, and that definitely includes groceries. But Reddit, they only are sharing this they only care about this headline currently because the outgroup's in power. I'm sure if Sleepy Joe was still in power, this would be downvoted and censored from Reddit. But since the Orange Man's in power, it's that's something they can't stop talking about. And it just goes to show you that they're against taxes now, but there'll be 4 taxes the second the in-group gets back into power, and it just goes to show you no principles, only teams. Just as a lot of people, like 80% of people at least, I would say these days, have no principles, only teams, and that's why you got to not treat politics like it's a team sport. You gotta stick by your principles regardless of which branch of the uniparty is in power. Next we have ex-Olympian who touched reflecting pool charged with felony destruction of property by Trump's DOJ from independent.co.uk, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't think they should be charging with that, but also, as I said earlier, the executive branch can enforce whatever laws it feels like, and that includes touching your reflecting pool. I do think it's interesting how they're going after a guy for touching the reflecting pool, but they're not going after anyone in the Epstein files. It just goes to show you that it's really just an Epstein class uniparty in charge, and everything else is really just political theater. The Epstein class always wins in the end. It's really the deep state military industrial complex satanic law of liberty people really running the show, whatever you want to call them, rather than the president or any of the congressional representatives of the Supreme Court. They're just figureheads first and foremost. I think we really don't know who's the people running the show, or the true power in Washington, I would say, operates out of the shadows rather than directly in the spotlight, like the U.S. government does when it comes to the Senate and the House. I think the real people in charge are the unelected bureaucrats, if anything else. Next, we have DOJ defends decision to withhold millions of Epstein documents from USAtoday.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Epstein subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think they should be doing that. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter because when the Democrats will get back in power, and then they'll withhold millions of Epstein documents too. It really just goes to show you they're pretty much an Epstein class uniparty. They're really all beholden to the same interest. Rather, despite how they use like LGBTQ and abortion to make themselves look so different, but in reality they agree on pretty much 95% of stuff. At least I would say. Next, we have OpenAI in talks to give Trump administration a 5% stake in the company. FT reports from edition.cnn.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I don't think private companies should be making deals, should be issuing stakes to the government, or I should say, the government shouldn't be buying stakes in private companies. But ultimately, the government can justify doing whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. What can you do? They control the courts and legal system as well, and oftentimes, when you control the courts and legal system, you can justify doing whatever you want to, and no one can hold you accountable. It's the old question that who watches the Watchmen. When you can't hold the Watchman accountable since he's the one he's watching over everyone. And yeah, it just goes to show you that the state is going to be inherently acting its own self-interest, and there's no way you can really hold it accountable. People might say voting, but 80% of people, as I said earlier, both major parties are pretty much in on it, and 80% of people are going to justify voting for the major parties no matter what. So there's really no way you can bring about change. Next, we have make all these young kids join the army. Fox News and the White House press secretary suggest forcing Gen Z into the military or sending them to Iran for complaining about the economy, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Underreported News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is here. If you want to join the army, you should be able to. I personally would like to. I've tried to thought about joining the military in the past, but they won't let me get in because I'm on SSRI. So but ultimately, I think the libertarian position is it should be optional if kids want to join the army or not. Same for everyone else. If you don't want to join the army, you shouldn't be forced to do so. And that's very much why I would very much disagree with the White House press secretary on this. But ultimately, if the government does want to force people to join the military, they oftentimes are able to. They've had a draft in the past. They don't have a draft currently, but ultimately they can justify instituting a draft and force people to join the military if they feel like it, because they're in a position of state authority, and peasants like us aren't. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have MAGA base stays quiet. New mandatory disclosure for all federal employees revealed that the president has earned $2.2 billion from NYTimes.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, Reddit only cares because it's out-group rather than in-group. They're completely fine with when people like Nancy Pelosi do it. They'll sweep it under the rug or say, well, both sides do it. But when Donald Trump does it, they'll say it's the worst thing ever, because they only really care about when the out group does it, not when the in group does it. But politics is going to be innately trying to enrich yourself and your allies, especially if how it's done currently. But Reddit only cares that the out group's trying to enrich itself and its allies. When the in group starts taking power and doing the same thing, they'll justify it or sweep it under the rug. Next, we have another illegal bribe to raise your electricity prices. Trump has made another agreement, this time with Duke Energy, to drop development of offshore wind. The $129 million payout to cancel the project brings the total over with $2.7 billion taxpayer dollars used to all clean energy products from electric.co, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross-post from the energy subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, the government shouldn't be involved with energy in the first place. Same with everything else. I think if private actors want to fund their energy projects, they should be able to, but I don't think the government should be funding energy projects because I think that gives them too much control over it, as you see here. But of course, Reddit, their conclusion is going to be, well, we should spend all our government money on clean energy projects. Well, in reality, well, completely ignoring that, when the outgroup takes power again, they can justify using the money to get rid of the clean energy project. It just goes to show you the government shouldn't be involved in energy in the first place. Same with pretty much everything else. Next, we have California's billionaire wealth tax is an asset seizure. Once they tally everything you own, they demand a percentage on top of what you've taxed every single year. Is already targeting anyone who over 50 million or more. This ends with your 401k. From Inger.com, posted by Economy Medicine Free 18, and that looks like a screenshot of a tweet from Rokana. I make the philosophical case for tax fairness and taxing billionaire wealth. I welcome an argument on the merits for this new social contract. Read here, open.substack.com/pub/RokanaUS. And yeah, personally, I think Rokana is probably one of the better Democrats in Congress. With that being said, taxing anyone is inherent, if they don't consent to it, is going to be inherently authoritarian, and that does include billionaires. I personally do think there are some billionaires I personally don't care for, like George Soros, but who want to enforce their values on others. But forcing people to do something they don't want to do is inherently authoritarian. That includes taxing, even for people you disagree with, like billionaires. And yeah, if billionaires want to pay voluntary taxes, I think they should be able to. Same for every other group, and that's my libertarian thoughts on that issue. I would say, if taxation should be voluntary, and if it isn't voluntary, you should very least be able to earmark where your taxpayer dollars go to. But sadly, with the current government in charge, they can justify forcing you to pay taxes whether you want to or not, and you don't even get to choose where the money goes to. Next, we have by Fox News to scare their viewers against democratic socialism, posted by Ragnar OKX3, and that's the crosswords from the There Was an Attempt subreddit. It looks like a screenshot of the Fox News, and then it's from the looks like the Will Cain show, and it says Medicare for all, college for all, housing for all, free 2-hour work week, tax the rich, Green New Deal, free Palestine, democratic socialists of America. And yeah, of course, Reddit's gonna like all those things because they're in-group coded rather than out-group coded. But you gotta ask the question: who's gonna pay for Medicare for all? Who's gonna pay for college for all? Who's gonna pay for housing for all? Who's gonna enforce a free 2-hour work week? People should be able to work however many long hours of work week they want to, and there shouldn't be a free 2-hour government mandated long work week or any government mandated long work week. Work however many hours you feel like. It should very much be individual decision rather than out of the state. Then there's tax the rich, which we just kind of talked about. If they're taxing billionaires, I personally don't care for all billionaires. I do think some of them are authoritarian, but it should be voluntary taxation first and foremost. They have Green New Deal, which I just think is going to result in a lot of authoritarian policies. And then they have Free Palestine, which I personally think I personally would kind of lean towards agreeing with. But I personally think libertarian positions we shouldn't be involved with Israel Palestine in the first place. They're on the other side of the world. Focus on the home front first and foremost. That's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have regular people get searched like terrorists at airports. Why does crossing a national border erase all of your rights and privacy? Posted by Amugus Devilman, and that's crosspost from the False Libertarian subreddit. And I would agree with that. Just because you're crossing a national border doesn't erase all your rights and privacy. I do think, some immigration restrictions might be justified, especially with the welfare state in place. But, ultimately, it comes down to what the state wants to justify since they're in a position of authority. And oftentimes they're just going to justify doing whatever they want since they're in a position of government authority and you aren't. And then they linked to some video on that, and they added the heavy-handed treatment of ordinary people at airports indicated where governments would make daily like if they thought they could. And I would agree with that. If the state very much gets what it does, like what they think they can get away with, like say pretty much everything else. If the state thought they could get away with locking us down in our houses for years, like they did during COVID, they would be able to. And oftentimes, there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have, on America's 250th birthday, the United States arms the world's tyrannies, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the U.S. should be arming other tyrannical countries, but ultimately, they're in a position to where they can send arms wherever they want to, and oftentimes there's nothing you do about it. I think it's interesting, they send so much arms trafficking overseas, like when Obama did that Timber Sycamore program, and those guns ended up in a lot of ISIS's hands. But when it comes to here, they're all the politicians are all we gotta have sensible gun control. It's just going to show you they have no principles, only teams. They're fine with arms trafficking to other countries, but second, you have the guns that they constantly throw overseas. Suddenly you're a danger to society, and we got to have sensible gun control. Just goes to show you, no principles, only teams, and the government's gonna justify whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have The Great American Betrayal from thehill.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for The Great American Betrayal, but, ultimately the state can justify doing whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. That ties into a post I made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, Reflections on America 250. I said, I definitely don't think the Founding Fathers were perfect by any means. They have arguably enabled the authoritarianism of the current government with their belief in democracy, even if they wanted it limited to only white land-holding males in their own time. I wish I could go back in time and hot pill them. With that being said, I definitely do think we are better off than we would have been otherwise if not for them, especially when you look at how bad the UK is right now, especially when it comes to stuff like free speech. They arrested for pretty much any dissent all on social media. I'm extremely glad that what they did, the American people of today would be very wise to follow their example, but sadly, I think we are just too complacent these days. Anyways, have a happy 4th. The fight for liberty that the Founding Fathers began is something that never truly ends. And I also added in the comments, Happy 250th America, don't know how much more you've got left in you. And another commenter added, my birthday wish for the United States is that we will survive and people will push back on an authoritarian trend. Democracy is impossible without preserving the truly essential individual freedoms, essentially free speech, no matter how much risky or difficult that feels. And I replied, democracy is an inherently flawed system that assumes people are rational actors, which in reality they're anything but. Libertarians should not be supporting a system that punishes Thomas Massey but rewards Lindsey Graham. And yeah, I personally think, the libertarian position is democracy is inherently forced collectivism. I think it's a lot of interesting that Redditors like it, because Reddit Hitler, aka Donald Trump, Orange Man, he was elected democratically and they hate him. Hell, actual Hitler was elected democratically too, and they really don't like him. So, ultimately I think the libertarian perspective is you gotta get rid of democracy and forced collectivism. I think if voluntary collectives want to have votes among themselves, they should be able to, but I don't think everyone should be forced into a forced collective and like a country level thing if they don't want to. But sadly, you're not allowed to opt out of a country and its laws regardless of how you feel, and that's very much, I think, anti-libertarian. I think the libertarian positions, if you want to opt out for whatever reason, you should be able to, but sadly that's not the society we currently live in. So I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.